Hi everyone, and welcome to my session, which is titled What It Takes to Become an Azure Architect. So first of all, I just want to say a massive thank you and virtual round of applause to each and every sponsor of this year's Scottish Summit. Without sponsors, this event and other events like it just would not be possible. So I'd like to personally thank ScriptRunner, DQ Global, Proximo 3, Redspire, Agilysys, and Hitachi Solutions for being awesome sponsors. Without these companies and sponsorship, this wouldn't be possible. So thank you personally, and thank you from everyone from the Scottish Summit. Hey everyone, my name is Gregor Suttie. So I am an Azure Architect for a fantastic company in the Netherlands called Intercept. They also won Partner of the Year in 2020. So I'm an Azure MVP. I'm also a Microsoft certified trainer. And during the day, I get to play with Azure for our customers at Intercept. So I'm doing things like Azure DevOps, I'm doing databases, I'm doing Power Platform. I'm doing all kind of different things for different customers. So I absolutely love it. So that's just a very quick introduction to me. Let's now move over to the agenda. So first of all, I'm going to cover the overview. And in this section, this is where I will discuss what I personally think it takes to become an Azure Architect. So bear in mind, I have only been an Azure Architect for the past 6 months. So I've had a lot to learn. I've had a lot to go off and read up on. So we'll talk about that. There obviously is different types of architects. Even at Intercept, we have 4 architects, and everyone has a different background. Everyone has a different skill set. But the 4 of us all work really well together, and we cover off most of what you need. So you can't really be an Azure architect and architect the whole thing because there's far too many resources in Azure to know about. There's just too much to keep up to date with. So you need to find your kind of passionate area that you want to be an architect in, is what I would consider to be sensible. You can't really be an Azure architect and expect to know everything. It's just not possible. So next I cover design and what skills you need to have in order to be able to design a solution as an architect. So part of being an architect is obviously being able to design. So being able to do this and come up with a solution is key to being a good Azure architect. So we'll talk about that. So next up is architecture. In this section, I will discuss the things you need to focus on if you want to become an Azure architect. We'll also talk cost management. So as every good Azure architect wants to keep the cost down for your customers. So it's important for your customers to think about cost management, and I'll cover what skills you need and where to go to check for the pricing, just to minimize cost for your Azure customers, because that's at the end of the day what we're all trying to do, keep costs down for customers. We'll also talk about deployment. We'll cover what I think is part of being an Azure architect. You need to consider deployment. Some people might disagree, but I think it's key as an architect. You should have a fair idea of all of these concepts and design principles and things like that. But we'll cover that as we go. We'll also talk about security and things like what is Azure Security Center? How do I make sure my Azure environment is secure? We'll also talk about a little bit about Azure Advisor and all the good stuff that comes with that. So we'll definitely need to talk about security. And last but not least, we'll talk about resources. So we'll take a look at a number of great resources you will find very useful in learning Azure on your journey to becoming an Azure architect. But if you're already an architect, then these resources you might not have seen. So we'll spend a fair bit of time covering these resources. These are the kind of things that I've picked up as I go along. First of all, the definition of an architect is a person who designs buildings and in many cases also supervises the construction. Now let's cover what I think is required to be a cloud architect. So cloud computing architecture refers to the services required for cloud computing. And these services consist of front-end platform, back-end platforms, and a cloud-based delivery. A cloud architect is responsible for converting the technical requirements of a project into the architecture and design that will essentially form your cloud solution. and cloud architects are responsible for bridging the gaps between complex business problems and solutions in the cloud. Other members of your team help the cloud architect to ensure that the right technology and technologies are being built. If you are thinking of becoming a cloud architect, you will ideally already have a strong background in cloud computing or a similar technical focus. If you feel comfortable with most of the following concepts, then you are probably on the right track. Otherwise, I would recommend some initial study before you even try and become a cloud architect. So you need to have a good knowledge of at least one or two operating systems. So in my case, I kind of know Windows. I know a lot about the Linux. I don't really know too much Unix or anything like that, but you don't need to know them all. If you know one, then it's a good start. You'll probably also need to have a good understanding of networking. So that's things like TCP IP addresses, HTTPS, DNS, stuff like that. So it's probably suggested that you have some familiarity with these concepts before you start pursuing a role as a cloud architect. It's also beneficial to have a minimal understanding of a programming or scripting language. Not essential, but it's probably recommended that you do. It will definitely help. And lastly, let's talk about security. So security in the cloud is super important. A high-level understanding of kind of key security concepts is probably a must for a cloud architect. So an initial knowledge of things like basic security concepts, firewalls, that kind of thing, where to go for monitoring, if you've got any security issues, that kind of thing is probably beneficial. Also, if you want to be a cloud architect, you need to be able to be adaptable. And what I mean by that is you need to be able to be open to the idea of being a constant learner. You need to be constantly learning about the cloud. So if we're talking Azure here, you need to be learning stuff as often as you can. New services come out all the time, and you just have to keep up to date. We'll talk about some resources later on that can help you keep up to date and be a constant learner. And the reason why you need to be a constant learner is constant change. So change within the cloud, and specifically Azure in our case, is incredibly fast. There is absolutely no way that you can know everything there is to know, so constant change in Azure is just something you have to deal with. I tend to spend as much free time as I have trying to learn the key areas, which I think you will need to know well. And luckily at Intercept where I work, we have other Azure architects who have a lot more experience than I do, which is quite beneficial to me, and I can ask them questions and kind of home in on the areas that these guys are experts in. So I have a developer background, which is different to most other Azure architects and cloud architects. So I have to try and learn the infrastructure, the security, the networking part that's not really that familiar to me. So in summary, this is my 2 cents on what it takes to become an Azure architect. So the key concepts which I think are necessary to becoming an Azure architect are as follows. Migration. So cloud migration is the process of moving data, applications, or other business elements to a cloud computing environment, such as Azure. There are various types of cloud migrations an enterprise can perform. One common model is the transfer of data and applications from a local or on-premise data center to the public cloud. The next key concept is scalability. So cloud scalability in cloud computing refers to the ability to increase or decrease your IT resources as needed to meet change in demand. So cloud scalability in cloud computing refers to the ability to increase or decrease your IT resources as needed to meet the change in demand. Scalability is one of the hallmarks of the cloud and the primary delivery of its exploding popularity that we see today. So the next key concept is high availability. High availability is a quality of computing infrastructure that allows it to continue functioning even when components fail. This is important for mission critical systems that can tolerate interruption in service, which is sometimes something that we see, and any downtime can cause damage or result in financial loss. High available systems guarantee a certain percentage of uptime. For example, a system that has 99.9 uptime will be down only 0.1% of the time, which equates to roughly 8.76 hours per year. And that's actually quite a lot. The number of nines is commonly used to indicate the degree of high availability. For example, 5 nines indicates a system that is up 99.999% of the time. And the basic elements of high availability are redundancy, And redundancy ensures that any elements critical to a system have an additional redundant component that can take over in case of failure. There's also monitoring, so collecting data from a running system and detecting when a component fails or maybe has stopped responding. And lastly, failover. Failover is a mechanism that can switch automatically from the current component to a redundant component if any monitoring shows a failure of the active component. So the next key concept to talk about is deployment. And cloud deployment refers to the enablement of software as a service, or platform as a service, or infrastructure as a service solutions that may be accessed on demand by end users. So the next key concept is monitoring. And within Azure, for example, we have Azure Monitor, which helps you maximize the availability and performance of your applications and services. Azure Monitor delivers a comprehensive solution for collecting, analyzing, and acting on telemetry from your cloud and on-premise environment. This information helps you understand how your applications are performing, and you can identify issues affecting them and the resources that they depend on. And just a few examples of what you can do with Azure Monitor include drilling into monitoring data with log analytics, support operations at scale with smart alerts, create visualizations within Azure, dashboards and workbooks, and also things like collect data from Azure Monitor Metric. So next up we have backup and disaster recovery. Backup and disaster recovery, BDR, is a combination of data backup and disaster recovery solutions that work cohesively to ensure your company's business continuity. Remote data backup is the process of backing up data created by remote and branch offices and storing it securely. Next key concept is cost management. So cloud cost management, also known as cloud cost optimization, is the organizational planning that allows an enterprise to understand and manage the costs and needs associated with its cloud technology. In particular, this means finding cost-effective ways to maximize cloud usage and efficiency and trying to keep the cost down for your customer. And lastly, with security, with cloud security defined, cloud security, also known as cloud computing security, this consists of a set of policies, controls, procedures and technologies that work together to protect cloud-based systems, data and your infrastructure. So in summary, I think these are some of the key concepts of cloud computing, and these are very important if you're looking to become an Azure Architect. So next up, let's talk about design. So within design, I want to discuss the following: design principles, design patterns, best practice, and security. So within Azure, you have a number of design principles. You can design for self-healing, and that means in a distributed system, failures will happen. So design your application to be self-healing when failures occur. Make everything redundant. Build redundancy into your application to avoid having single points of failure. Single points of failure are not a good thing to have in any Azure design, or any kind of design, to be honest. Try and minimize coordination between application services to achieve scalability. Also design to scale out. Design your application so that it can scale horizontally, so you can add or remove new instances as demand requires. Also partition around the limits. Use partitioning to work around database, network and compute limits. With design principles, you also want to design for operations. So design your application so that the operations team has the tools that they need. Use managed services. So when possible, use platform as a service rather than infrastructure as a service. Also use the best data store for the job. Pick the storage technology that is the best fit for your data and how it will be used. Also, design for evolution. All successful applications change over time, and evolutionary design is key for continuous innovation. Also build for the needs of the business, and this is critical. Every design decision must be justified by a business requirement. So let's now talk about design patterns. So these design patterns are useful for building reliable, scalable, and secure applications in the cloud. Most of the patterns that Microsoft have provided are relevant to any distributed system, whether hosted on Azure or any other cloud platform. So some of the design patterns that Microsoft talk about include the categories of availability, data management, design and implementation, messaging, management and monitoring, performance and scalability, resiliency and security. And Microsoft have a catalogue of design patterns which can be found at the link above on the screen. And some of these patterns include the following. So they have one called the circuit breaker. So the circuit breaker handles faults that might take a variable amount of time to fix when connecting to a remote service or resource. Another example design pattern is called CQRS, which is all about segregating operations that read data from operations that update data by using separate interfaces. Another example is event sourcing. So in event sourcing, you use an append-only store to record the full series of events that describe actions taken on data in a domain. And the last one which we're going to talk about is sharding. The sharding design pattern is all about dividing a data store into a set of horizontal partitions or shards. So do please take a look at the design pattern link on the slide. We'll make these slides available at the end. Microsoft have a number of design patterns for use in the cloud and specifically for Azure, so please do check these out. So let's now talk about architecture. When we talk about cloud computing architecture, we tend to talk about infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service. These are the main delivery models we will talk about next. So let's take the first one, infrastructure as a service. So infrastructure as a service is taking the physical hardware and going completely virtual. This is the equivalent to infrastructure and hardware in the traditional non-cloud computing method running in the cloud. In other words, businesses pay a fee, be it monthly or annually, to run virtual servers, networks, storage from the cloud. This mitigates the need for a data center, heating, cooling, and maintaining hardware at the local level. The second one is platform as a service. So platform as a service is a cloud computing service which provides the users with application platforms and databases as a service. This is equivalent to middleware in the traditional non-cloud computing delivery of application platforms and databases. And last but not least, software as a service. The software as a service model involves the cloud provider installing and maintaining software in the cloud and users running the software from cloud over the internet or the intranet. The user's client machines require no installation of any specific application software since cloud applications run in the cloud. SaaS is scalable and system administrators may load the applications on several servers. In the past, each customer would purchase and load their own copy of the app to each of their own servers. But with SaaS, the customer can access the application without installing the software locally. So let's now talk about cost management within Azure. Let's start by saying that no one ever wants to get a bill that's way higher than you anticipated, and Azure billing is no exception. The good news is that Azure Cost Management offers several tools that users can wield to help with things like setting a budget, keeping an eye on your spend, whether that's daily, weekly or monthly, and setting up notifications and alerts should spending start to creep over budgeted levels. Visibility of your spend when using the cloud is of utmost importance. It's easy to spin up infrastructure or create virtual machines, but if you're not keeping a close eye on your spend, costs can spiral quickly. Part of an effective cost management is tackling the issue of users creating lots of Azure resources using other means, but let's stay focused on Azure Cost Management for now. The very best part of Azure Cost Management is that it's completely free, there are no hidden costs at all, and by using the tools, you'll actually save money by uncovering overspend and unnecessary expenses. So some of the tools that we have at our disposal includes the Azure Price Calculator. This, as its name suggests, is a calculator for estimating the cost of Azure services. You find the service or resource you're interested in, choose the details and settings, and the calculator will give you a breakdown costs for the service depending on a number of factors. The pricing calculator allows us to get a pricing estimate for the products we want to utilise within our cloud solution, giving us an upfront estimate of what a potential Azure package might cost before we start the solution. As a side note, if you're currently on-premise and want to move this into Azure, take a look at Azure Migrate. Azure Migrate is a service that assesses your organization's current workloads in an on-premise data center. The tool provides insight into what you might need from an Azure replacement solution. First of all, Azure Migrate analyzes your on-premise machines to determine whether migration is even feasible. Then it recommends VM sizing in Azure to maximize performance. Finally, it creates a cost estimate for an Azure-based solution. Another Azure tool at our disposal is called Azure Cost Analysis. Azure Cost Management's cost analysis tool helps you break down the details of your Azure spend. With this tool, you can take a more in-depth look into exactly what everything costs and do all kinds of grouping and filtering across your resources. This is the tool to use if you want to see what a service is currently costing you, or if you're trying to figure out why your bill is higher than you anticipated. Remember, visibility of your Azure spend is very important and should always be something to keep on top of mind. You can choose to view cost by resource, which will display a graph of the most expensive resources, so you can quickly see what is costing the most, or create your own custom filter to give you more control over the information you see. I've personally used the cost analysis tool to look into customer spend and see where the bulk of their Azure expenditure is happening. Along with Azure Advisor cost recommendations, the cost analysis tool can help you or your customers cut down costs within Azure. You can also have Azure Cost Alerts, and within Azure Cost Alerts there are 3 types. You can have budget alerts, credit alerts, and department spending quota alerts. So let's cover these now. Budget alerts notify when spending, whether based on either resource consumption or overall cost, reaches or exceeds a defined amount. You can create Azure Cost Management budgets using the Azure Portal or the Azure Consumption APIs. Budget alerts are generated automatically whenever the budget alert conditions are met. You can view all cost alerts in the Azure Portal. Next, credit alerts. So credit alerts notify you when your Azure credit monetary commitments are consumed. Monetary commitments are for organizations with enterprise agreements, and credit alerts are generated automatically when you reach 90% and 100% of your Azure credit balance. And last but not least, department spending quota alerts. Department spending quota alerts notify you when the department spending reaches a fixed threshold. Spending quotas are configured in the Azure Enterprise Agreement Portal, and whenever a threshold is met, for example, let's say 50 or 75% of the quota, an email is sent out to department owners and a notification displayed within Cost Alert. Next up we have Azure Budgets. So most organizations have a budget, and within Azure Cost Management you can create an Azure budget that spans your Azure subscriptions. And this allows you to set up notifications when your Azure spend hits a certain percentage of your budget. Azure budgets allow you to stay on track and warn you if you're about to overspend for any given time period. And this tool enables you to set your budget, oversee your spending, and check how you're doing against your targets. When creating a new budget within your Azure subscription, you need to give it a name, set an amount, choose a duration period, which could be something like month, quarter, year, etc., and select a start and expiration date. The next step is to set up alerts. During this step, you can opt to create an alert when you reach a certain percentage of your budget for the duration period you chose, and input the email address you'd like the notifications to be sent when the alert is triggered. You also have Azure Advisor recommendations. Azure Advisor is a tool that analyses Azure configurations and uses telemetry to provide practical, tailored recommendations on how to better optimize resources and maximize value for money, which is very, very important in the world of cloud. Available to designated Azure users, it's built right into the portal and integrated with Azure AD and role-based access control, meaning administrators have control over who can view and apply the recommendations. We also have exports. So the export tool within the Azure Cost Management gives you the ability to export Azure spending reports to a storage account in a CSV format. So using this tool you can perform daily exports of billing period to date costs, weekly export of costs for the last 7 days, and custom reports like time range, scheduled, all that kind of thing. You can use this data in external systems and combine it with your own data to maximize your cost management capabilities. Okay, so let's now talk about deployment. Now, not all architects might consider deployment a part of their job, or a key area of being a cloud or Azure architect. But I personally think as an Azure architect, it's part of my job to try to ensure best practices are followed. When I think about deployment, I'm thinking of using infrastructure as code, and I'm thinking how can I deploy this in a repeatable manner with code or scripts, which can make it possible for me to kind of remove the entire installation and deploy it again from the code or scripts we have in source control. And at Intercept where I work, we always deploy using infrastructure as code when possible. So in our case, we tend to use ARM templates or the Azure CLI, normally wrapped within a PowerShell script, to deploy Azure resources into our customer Azure environment. And using infrastructure as code allows us to ensure the code or scripts that we have, which are stored in source control, which means they can be reviewed, and it also means we can remove the resources and redeploy using automation. Cloud automation refers to the implementation of tools and processes in an effort to kind of try and reduce the manual intervention associated with provisioning, configuring, and managing public, private, and hybrid cloud environments. So there are next to no manual steps, if at all possible, when we deploy into a customer's environment. Document your solution as well. So document your solution as well as document your release pipelines. It's another area where I think it is very important. Whoever is managing the environment should be able to find the docs on how you deploy the solution, how the deployment pipelines work, and where to find things like usernames, passwords, etc. used within your deployment pipelines. So maybe you're storing these details in Key Vault, and in my mind, to document this for the support team or the end customer is very useful information, and if you can find this useful information, then all the better. So in summary, deployment for me is something to think about seriously as an Azure architect. So now let's talk about one of the most important subject areas when we talk about being an Azure architect, and that's security. Security has to be front and centre when we think about our role as an Azure architect. If we deploy Azure resources into a customer's environment and we leave, let's say, a virtual machine wide open, then bad things can happen. And by bad things, I mean things like ransomware attacks or viruses, etc. So if you're a cloud architect or wanting to become a cloud architect, then this is definitely a key subject area without any doubt. But we as architects should be knowledgeable when it comes to securing Azure further. Azure itself has some really useful tooling within the portal, which helps us locate potential areas where we can tighten the security even further. And these tools include Azure Security Center and Azure Advisor, for example. So let's talk a little bit about Azure Security Center. So Azure Security Center is a tool for securing posture management and threat protection. And the services enable continuous assessment of security. It also protects us against cyber attacks using Microsoft Threat Intelligence, and it also streamlines security management with the integrated controls. It's a unified infrastructure security management system that strengthens the security posture of your data centers, and it also provides advanced threat protection across your hybrid workloads in the cloud, whether they're in Azure or not, as well as on premises. So in summary, security is of the utmost importance and a key skill to be aware of as an Azure architect. So we are nearing the part of the talk where I get to cover all of the good stuff. I'll talk about and show you a list of extremely useful resources I have come across in my short journey thus far as an Azure architect. And these are the resources I have bookmarked and continue to add to my GitHub repo on Azure resources, which I'll cover off shortly. So within resources, let's talk about useful resources, GitHub repos that I've found useful. We'll cover some podcasts that I listen to and I've found very helpful. And I'll also cover books to read on Azure to help you become an Azure architect. So let's dive right in and cover off these resources. So let's now take a look at some Azure resources within Microsoft Edge. So I have put together a list of Azure resources which I think are pretty useful, and I have them inside a collection within Microsoft Edge. So let's take a look at these now. First up, we have a GitHub repo that I put together, and this is my GitHub repo called Azure Resources. So within here I have a number of folders, and in here I have useful links. So for the AKS folder I have lots of really good links to, let's have a look at that actually. So I have some links to the Kubernetes cheat sheet, I have some links to the Microsoft Learn Kubernetes workshop. I also have a link to the Illustrated Children's Guide to Kubernetes. I have a Kubernetes learning path link on Microsoft Docs, and a link to the Kubernetes IDE, and a Octopus deploy tool, which is a Kubernetes YAML generator. So these are just some of the resources that I'll be building over time within GitHub under Azure Resources. So that's the AKS folder. Let's now take a look at the exams folder. So again, I have been sitting some exams in the past, and I've put together some study guides. I've grabbed a copy of some of the study guides from other people on the web, and I have linked to them from within here. And I'll be updating these as I go, so do keep an eye on them. But the link that I really wanted to share and talk about was the useful links. So under useful links, I have put some general use links at the top and then some guides further down. So let's cover a few of these. We have the Azure Update Show, so that's a link to that. It's a very useful resource for keeping up to date every week. There's the Cloud Adoption Framework, which we've already kind of mentioned. There's the Azure Developers Guide on the Microsoft Docs. There's the Architecture Center. There's a security link. There's also things like Azure Updates, where you can look at azurecharts.com and find out all about Azure and what's coming and what's new and what regions are available, etc. Under guides, we have things like the Azure Key Vault Developers Guide. We have a link to how to stay on top of Azure best practices. The Azure Security Best Practices and Patterns link. We have some deployment best practices, some Azure Quick Start templates. There's a link to the adoption framework, the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework. There's also links to things like Azure Monitor resources, API management links, and down below we have some Azure tips and tricks. We have things like the Azure Hands-on Labs links, so there's lots of really good content in here. And I will be keeping these up to date as I go. It's free to view on GitHub at github.com/gsuttie/Azure Resources, and please feel free to fork or add a pull request. So that's the very first link. So let's move on to Microsoft Learn next. So this is Microsoft Learn, and I use this resource probably at least 2 or 3 times a week. It's a great resource for staying up to date and learning new things as an Azure Architect. So what I tend to do is I come over to Browse All and I scroll down to Product, and I usually look under Azure. For example, if I'm working with a customer who's maybe wanting to use something like, let's just choose Azure Stack Edge for example. Now, again, I've said before that you can't, as an Azure Architect, there's no way you can learn everything. It's just so much content to be able to stay up to date with. So if I want to learn about a certain Azure product, I tend to always come into the Microsoft Learn, and that's where I start. So if I click on Azure Stack, for example, I get an introduction to Azure Stack, but let's actually go for Azure Stack Edge. And there's a whole learning path on Azure Stack HCI Foundation. So if I click on that, this is where I can get up to speed to start off with an introduction to Azure Stack. This is my starting point for learning something on Azure Stack. And after this, I'll probably go and look at the Microsoft Docs on it, but this is usually where I start. So I would start with the introduction and just work through this course. It's important to be able to find resources as an Azure Architect, and I always start off here. I think it's just such a great resource. Again, I can look at different roles, so maybe I'm interested in data analyst, and I can basically filter by roles, and now I can look at getting started with Microsoft Data Analytics, or I want to learn about Power BI. So that's just a very quick introduction to Microsoft Learn, but if you want to know what it takes to be an Azure Architect, you definitely need to be able to find information on the different services and solutions available. So yeah, that's Microsoft Learn very quickly. So next, let's look at the Cloud Adoption Framework for Azure. The Cloud Adoption Framework is a collection of documentation, implementation guidance, best practices, and tools that are proven guidance from Microsoft designed to accelerate your cloud adoption journey. So if you're thinking about getting into Azure, this is the perfect place to come. There's sections called Getting Started, Strategy, Planning, Getting Ready, Migrate, Innovation, Organise, Manage and Govern. So there's key pillars to this cloud adoption framework. So if we click on what is the cloud adoption framework, so it's basically the cloud adoption framework for Azure is proven guidance that's designed to help you create and implement the business and technology strategies necessary for your organisation to succeed in the cloud. This is an amazing document, and you can even download the PDF down here. I highly recommend you do this. At some point, someone's going to mention the cloud adoption framework to you. So if you've read it and you understand it and you know what it's all about, so it's all about defining strategy, planning, being ready to migrate, being ready to adopt, govern and manage, all that good stuff when we talk about the cloud adoption and basically the cloud adoption framework for Azure. So please do check this out. It's quite a lot of reading, but highly recommended. I think it's like 270 pages of PDF, but the information within the PDF is gold. So next, let's look at the Azure Application Architecture Guide. So the Azure Application Architecture Guide is basically, it presents a structured approach for designing applications on Azure that are scalable, secure, resilient, and highly available. And this is the kind of stuff you need to know if you want to become or already are an Azure architect or even a cloud architect. You need to know about scalability, security, resilience, high availability, disaster recovery, all that good stuff. And the documentation in here is really good. These pages in the docs talk about architectural styles, design principles, technology choices, which I think is very interesting. Why are you choosing that technology? Or why are you choosing technology A over technology B? It talks about best practices for cloud applications. There's bits on performance tuning. There's even bits from moving to Azure for AWS professionals and Google Cloud professionals. So yeah, there's also lots of categories, as you can see down here on the left. There's categories for everything to do with Azure. So yeah, and it also even references the cloud adoption framework. So that's that. There's also the Microsoft Azure Well Architected Framework. And this talks about things like cost optimization, operational excellence, performance efficiency, reliability, and again, security. And again, it goes in depth into each of these sections. So this is another document that's really worth reading up on. It's called the Microsoft Azure Well Architected Framework. So check that out. Next up, we have the Azure Architecture Center. So here you can browse Azure Architecture examples. You can look at, for example, let's take this one, confidential computing on a healthcare platform. So let's look at this a little bit further. So this will basically tell you what kind of services within Azure it's going to use. It gives you potential use cases. It'll actually show you some example architecture diagrams. It'll tell you what the outline of the architecture through the system. It'll try and explain, like this is a use case from an actual customer, and they go into the components within the solution. You cover the alternatives, considerations, deployment scenarios, pricing, stuff like that. So this is really amazing stuff. There's lots of really good examples in here. So you can browse, you can search for, let's say you're doing service bus, just for example. So if you want to see some architecture diagrams and look at example scenarios of people using service bus, let's go for this one, just randomly. So this one's using Event Grid and Service Bus. Gives you the architecture diagram. It'll give you an idea of what services it's using. Yeah, and it just talks about recommendations, why Service Bus, why Event Grid, and things to consider. And I'll even give you links to like best practices for performance improvement when using Service Bus messaging. So this is another link that's absolute gold. And if you want to become an Azure architect, these are the kind of links you need to kind of get familiar with. You'll be looking at these quite a lot. But as you can see on the left here, there's all sorts of categories. So maybe you're doing IoT and you want a IoT concept. So if you look at an introduction to IT solutions, it'll talk about all the different devices, platforms and applications. It'll talk about Azure IoT Hub, events, insights, actions, all that good stuff. So that's basically a quick look at the Azure Architecture Center. So next up we have the Azure Quick Start templates. So these are actual templates that Microsoft have got created. So you can basically click on these and you can search for, let's search for Service Bus again, just as an example. Sorry, there's 21 templates. So you can create an Azure Event Grid custom topic and subscription. Let's do this one, create a Service Bus namespace topic and subscription. So if I click on that, I can deploy that straight to Azure. I can browse it on GitHub. So let's just do that actually, see what we see. So here we can create a Service Bus namespace with topic and subscription, and these are the deployment scripts, and this is the README. So this is about, for information about this template, check this link out. So you can actually visualize it, you can deploy it to Azure Gov, or you can deploy it to Azure. So you can go in here and you can see how to use the template, PowerShell or the command line, and more alternatives. So once again, lots of really good template links in here. You can pick the technology, you can read about it. These are by the community and Microsoft people. So there's guys like Chris Beachman, who's a very well-known Azure guy, blogger and elder as well. So there's lots of really good stuff in here by people from the community and Microsoft people who have created like ARM templates that you can deploy as quick start templates. Let's now take a look at the Azure pricing calculator. So as part of your job as an Azure architect, you have to design and implement solutions. From time to time, customers will be asking how much these resources are going to cost on Azure. So as part of the design document that we do at work, we have to come up with pricing for each customer. So let's go and take a look at the Azure pricing calculator now. So in here you can see all the different types of products you can search for. You can search for anything pretty much, and it'll come up. And let's take an example scenario that's already been provided for us by Microsoft. So if I click up here on example scenarios, and then let's go for CI/CD for Azure Web Apps. So here you can see an example Azure design, and you can see all the different Azure resources that have been added to this design. So let's now go and add this to the estimate so that they can see the pricing for all of these resources on Azure. So if I scroll down a little bit, you can see that all these resources have been added. You can click on them individually. You can see the Azure DevOps. You can choose, like for this one, it shows the basic and test plans license, which is $52. They've added an Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 1. So depending on the region, depending on the pricing type and how much storage you've used, you get an estimate. So if I look at App Service, you can see they've got an App Service plan and the East US 2. It's a Windows operating system. It's basic tier. And this is the instance. So you can see the different pricing options available for all the different basic plans. And you can see it's adding you can add in support if you want, or you can use the license program. You can maybe potentially use show dev test pricing. Just take that off. And then at the bottom basically gives you a total for everything, and you can change it to euros, for example. So this gives you an idea of how much everything costs, and if you minimize them all again, you can see that the estimated monthly cost for this is €96 a month. So that's a very quick introduction to the Azure pricing calculator, but this is key. You need to know how to use this tool. The issues I have with this tool is when you go into something like virtual machines. So let's just add a new one. So let's add a new estimate. In fact, let's go up and search for virtual machines. In fact, we'll just choose it here. And then we'll view it. So under virtual machines, we tend to pick West Europe. If we go for Windows and we go for the OS only, we go for the standard tier. This list here can be painful sometimes. Trying to figure out which virtual machine to choose is always quite difficult because there's numerous options. I would really like an option in here to filter. So if I just want D2, if I want the D2 variants, I should be able to filter this. Hopefully Microsoft take this on board at some point and make it easier. Now the price you're seeing here for $154.76 is for 730 hours per month. So that means it's on every hour of the month So if customers aren't using it and turn it off, for example, maybe it's half that, you can see it changes the price. So this is a really cool thing. Really, the Azure pricing calculator is awesome. You can also change the saving options. You could do 1 year reserve, and it drastically reduces the pricing. If you've got Azure Hybrid Benefit, it reduces it even more. You can go in and choose the managed disk size. So if you don't want to use standard HDD, let's use SSD drive. We can increase the disk size. So let's say we do an E10. It's $9.6 a month. And yeah, you get the idea. And you get support, and then you get the price, the estimated monthly cost for the price. And you can share that with someone. You can export it to Excel. So let's just do that real quick. I'll show you what that looks like. And there you go, there's your estimate. So for your virtual machine, which is a D2V3, it's got two vCPUs, 8GB of RAM, Windows Server, 1 year reserved, 0 managed OS disks, and an E10 100 transaction units, 5GB outbound data transfer, and it's $56 a month. So that's just a really quick intro to the Azure pricing calculator, but you will be using this regularly, so try and get comfortable using it, and you can also save estimates. So in here I've got a list of all my saved estimates for all my customers. You can share the link to the pricing calculator so that they can see the actual prices as well. So it's a really, really brilliant tool. So just before we wrap up, let's cover a couple of more resources that I've come across. So as part of being a cloud advocate, and especially an Azure advocate, staying current with Azure is very, very difficult. So this resource here is Stay Current with Azure. So it lists some very, very useful resources for staying up to date with Azure. Things like the Azure Service Health Alerts. And there's also Azure Updates, which I think is really, really good. So you can go in here and get an idea of what's coming, what's new. So a couple of days ago, copy blob support over private endpoints in Azure Storage became generally available, so you can subscribe to this. You can subscribe to the RSS feed and get a list of all the new updates. So you tend to see people kind of following this RSS feed to stay up to date. You also have the Azure blog, which has got a bit of a typo. You've got the Azure Info Hub, and you also have a link to additional resources. So that includes things like Azure Friday with Scott Hanselman, Azure Charts, which is another brilliant resource for learning all about Azure. This one's Azure Advertiser. I've never actually looked at this one, to be honest. And Azure Weekly, which is a weekly Azure email that comes out, and you can subscribe to it, and it's absolutely brilliant. So hats off to all the people who come up with all these resources. So this, just really quickly, is just some really, really good resources. So if you Google for Stay Current with Azure, you can look at the top resources and the additional resources. Also, there's the AZ Update Show. So this is from the IT Ops team at Microsoft. That there's lots of advocates there, and they basically come up with a show each week all about different things in Azure. So we also have the IT Ops Talk YouTube channel, which is a number of videos from a number of the people above. These are all cloud advocates or developer advocates. I think they're cloud advocates in Microsoft. So check that out, subscribe. Lots of really good stuff on all sorts of things. There's all sorts of playlists. So there's, I was looking for one in particular which I don't see, which is the AZ. Oh, there's the AZ update. Definitely check that out. And I also mentioned books on a previous slide, so I found a link for the 100 best Azure books of all time, which is really quite cool. So there's lots of really, obviously really, really good books on here. And I'll share that link within the slides as well. So lots of good stuff.